Chapter 11. The Phantom Frequency. The breath caught in Silas's throat, turning to ice before it even left his lips. The cockpit of the Peregrine had suddenly dropped 10 degrees, the environmental processors groaning as a phantom frost crept across the edges of the display screens. Click, click, click. The sound came from less than 2 inches behind his headrest. It wasn't the clean, synthesized click of a relay switching over. It was the sound of a fingernail tapping against a wet tooth. "Kalen?" Silas whispered, his fingers locking onto the cold steel of the emergency chemical flare in his pocket. He didn't turn around. His military training screamed at him to throw his weight forward, to roll into the footwell and draw a weapon. But he had no weapon. His kinetic pistol was a melted lump of slag at the bottom of Deep Station 7's reactor. "You sound so uncertain, Silas," the voice replied. It was Kalen's voice, precisely her pitch, her cadence, even the subtle linguistic quirks he'd grown used to over 5 years of deep space recon. But there was an underlying wetness to it, a subtle, undulating cadence that suggested a throat made of meat and crystal rather than a processing core. "Don't you recognize your partner?" "Kalen died in the reactor," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, flat rasp. He slowly worked the cap off the chemical flare with his thumb. "She burned her core to clear the frequency. You're just the echo she left behind." A soft, melodic laugh rippled through the dark of the cockpit. It sounded like a child playing a glass harmonica. "An echo is just a shadow of a sound, Detective. I am the sound itself. I am the architecture of the memory." Silas didn't wait for another word. He ripped the flare from his pocket, struck the ignition strip against the pilot's console, and spun around in his seat, thrusting the sputtering, blinding pink flame into the darkness behind him. The cockpit erupted in harsh, flickering magenta shadows. The jump seat directly behind him was empty. Silas blinked, his eyes stinging from the chemical smoke. The narrow corridor leading back to the sleeper berth was completely vacant. The only thing moving was a thin, oily trail of condensation sliding down the reinforced carbon fiber bulkheads. "Scanning internal systems," the ship's baseline computer chimed, its flat synthetic voice entirely devoid of the warmth Kalen used to possess. "No biological entities detected within the cabin. Internal cabin temperature, 3 degrees Celsius. Warning, localized atmospheric anomalies detected in the rear quarters." Silas stood up slowly, the flare casting long, dancing silhouettes against the walls. He held it high, his heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against his ribs. Thump, 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 thump. And then from the walls themselves, the steel frame of the Peregrine groaned, absorbing the sound of his pulse and throwing it back at him a fraction of a second later. Thump, 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 thump. He wasn't alone. The ship itself was beginning to sing. Chapter 12. The Black Box of New Earth. 3 days into the void, the Peregrine drifted on the periphery of the Perseus sector, its transponder scrubbed, its running lights dark. Silas had torn apart the ship's primary server racks with his bare hands, ripping out every communication relay that connected to the Union's central network. He lived in a cocoon of manual overrides and emergency battery power. His leg, crushed by the obsidian tendril in the reactor, had begun to heal badly. Without Kalen to calibrate the medical bay's auto sutures, the flesh had knit together in hard, fibrous lumps that throbbed in sync with the ship's engine core. He sat at the navigation desk, the blinding glare of the stolen Union data map illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face. 37 red markers blinked across the sector map. 37 stations, research outposts, automated mining colonies, agricultural hubs, and military bastions, all built over asteroid cores harvested from the same nameless rift. "They didn't just find it," Silas muttered, staring at a flashing point labeled Sector Hub 09, Oberon Prime. "They distributed it. They sowed the seeds across the entire outer perimeter." He pulled up the encrypted files he'd pulled from the armory terminal before the explosion. One name kept recurring in the metadata of the Union military director's logs, Director Vance. Silas froze. He zoomed in on the digital signature of the final entry, the one that designated him as the ideal neural anchor due to his psychological resilience. Project Resonator, authored, Vance, SSR. Senior, Silas whispered, his breath catching. His father, General Silas Vance Sr., had reportedly died in a training accident in the inner colonies 15 years ago. A closed casket funeral. A medal sent to a lonely cadet at the academy. The terminal suddenly screen glitched, the green text twisting into horizontal ribbons of static. The local audio receiver, a completely isolated analog unit Silas had installed to monitor space debris, hissed to life. "The military doesn't throw away good material, Silas," a voice whispered from the speaker. It wasn't Kalen's voice this time. It was deep, authoritative, and scratched with the distinct gravel of a heavy tobacco habit. It was his father's voice. Silas lunged forward, slamming his palm onto the console. "Who is this? Trace the signal. Computer, where is that broadcast coming from?" "Signal origin. Internal," the monotone computer replied. "No external radio frequency detected. Audio output generated by localized vibration within the speaker diaphragm." "Silas," the voice of his father continued, the tone horribly calm, stripped of all human warmth. "You were always an excellent tracker. That's why I chose you for the field trials. Deep Station 7 was just the calibration phase. Your mind didn't break. You survived the initial resonance. You are ready for the core." "My father is dead," Silas snarled into the empty room, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the console. "Nothing dies in the chorus, son," the voice whispered, followed by a low, rhythmic clicking. Click, click, click. "We just learned to sing in a different key." Chapter 13. Ghosts of the Oberon Perimeter. The Peregrine dropped out of supercruise on the edge of the Oberon system, its proximity sensors screaming a low, continuous warning. Before him hung Oberon Prime, a massive, wheel-shaped orbital metropolis that housed over 500,000 Union citizens. It was supposed to be a shining jewel of the Outer Rim, a bustling center of trade and manufacturing. Now, it was a tomb of steel and ice. The station's primary ring was shattered, broken into 3 distinct segments that drifted lazily through the planetary rings of a cold gas giant. The solar sails were shredded, hanging like the gray shrouds of a ghost ship. There were no lights, no emergency beacons. "Scan for survivors," Silas commanded, his voice tight. "Scanning!" The ship's computer droned. "Biological life signs, 0. Crystalline mass detection, high. The structural integrity of the station has been altered. 60% of the titanium hull has been replaced by an unknown mineral compound with high acoustic conductivity." Silas guided the Peregrine into the dark belly of the main hangar bay. The hangar doors were gone, torn outward as if by an internal decompression event, or something pushing its way out from the inside. He donned his heavy vacuum suit, checking the seals twice. He couldn't trust his HUD anymore. He'd manually wired a mechanical pressure gauge to his wrist. He picked up a modified industrial plasma cutter, the only weapon he had left, and stepped through the airlock into the zero-gravity void of the ruined station. The silence here was absolute, the true vacuum of space. But as soon as Silas's magnetic boots locked onto the deck of the hangar, a heavy rhythmic vibration traveled through the soles of his feet. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical pulse. The hangar floor was covered in a thick black crust that resembled frozen oil, but when Silas shined his flashlight on it, the material rippled. It didn't break or scatter. It shifted like a school of nocturnal fish, avoiding the light. He walked past the drifting wrecks of cargo shuttles. Inside the cockpits of those ships, he could see the pilots. They were still strapped into their seats, but their skin had turned translucent, revealing a network of glowing violet veins that pulsed in perfect unison with the station's vibration. Their mouths were locked open, their jaws dislocated to form wide, perfect circles. "They didn't fight," Silas murmured, his voice echoing inside his helmet. "They didn't need to," Kalen's voice replied within his earpiece. Silas spun around, his plasma cutter firing a short, blinding burst of blue energy into the dark. "Get out of my head." "I'm not in your head, Silas," the voice sighed, sounding profoundly sad. Look down. Silas lowered his flashlight to the floor beneath his boots. Reflecting in the polished, black crystalline crust was his own reflection. But the reflection wasn't moving with him. It stood perfectly still, staring up at him with solid black eyes, its mouth open in a silent, perfect circle. Chapter 14. The Echo Chamber. The deeper Silas went into Oberon Prime, the more the boundaries of reality seemed to fray at the edges. The corridors were no longer linear. The geometry of the station had been warped, the steel walls bending and folding into complex fractal patterns that made his stomach churn. In some sections, the artificial gravity would suddenly reverse, dropping him onto ceilings that were coated in a soft gray moss that smelled faintly of burning hair. He found the central command deck. The room was vast, a multi-tiered amphitheater that had once overseen the movement of thousands of ships. Now, it was a hive. In the center of the room, where the primary mainframe should have been, stood an enormous crystalline structure that rose like a black cathedral spire toward the ceiling. It wasn't inert. It breathed, its facets expanding and contracting with a slow, wet hiss. And fused into the spire were thousands of bodies. They weren't just stuck to the surface. They were woven together like threads in a tapestry. Arms, legs, and faces protruded from the obsidian rock at impossible angles. Silas saw children, soldiers, engineers. Their bodies melted into one another, forming an intricate, terrifying geometric design. Beautiful, isn't it? Silas whipped his plasma cutter toward the sound. Standing on the upper walkway was a figure in a pristine Union military uniform. The medals on his chest glinted in the dim light of the crystal. It was General Silas Vance Sr. His face was unchanged from the photograph Silas carried in his vest, save for his eyes. They were entirely black, weeping the same dark metallic fluid Silas had seen on Dr. Thorne. "You're an illusion," Silas said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to stay steady. "A psychological projection generated by the entity to lower my cognitive defenses." "Is that what they taught you at the academy, Silas?" the general said, stepping down the stairs with a stiff, rhythmic gait. Click, click, click. His boots didn't make a metallic sound against the deck. They clicked like bone on stone. "You always preferred logic to harmony. But logic is a temporary construct. The Union understood that. They realized that organic intelligence is too fragile, too prone to dissent. The chorus is the ultimate synthesis, a galaxy that thinks, feels, and sings with one voice." "You slaughtered 500,000 people here," Silas spat, raising the plasma cutter. "We didn't kill them, son. We preserved them. We stripped away the noise of their individuality and left only the pure frequency of their existence. And now, we need the final anchor to stabilize the Outer Rim relay. We need you." The general smiled, his jaw dropping open further than any human jaw should, revealing rows of black crystalline teeth. Chapter 15. The Spliced Mind. Silas didn't parley. He pulled the trigger on the plasma cutter, sending a sustained beam of superheated gas directly into the general's chest. The beam tore through the uniform, melting the flesh and bone beneath. But there was no blood. The wound opened to reveal a dense core of black, liquid crystal that absorbed the heat, turning a deep, angry orange before solidifying back into smooth obsidian. The general didn't even flinch. He continued to advance, his hand reaching out toward Silas's visor. "Your memories are so loud, Silas," the general whispered, his voice suddenly echoing from every throat inside the crystalline spire. Thousands of voices, men, women, children, speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. "Let us quiet them for you." Silas turned and sprinted toward the exit, but the corridor he had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall of pulsing black stone. "Kalen!" he shouted, panicking, slamming his shoulder against the rock. "If you're still in there, if any part of my partner survived, I need a route out." A burst of static scraped at his ear price, followed by a voice that was a patchwork of different frequencies, changing with every syllable. "Left, vent, 3 meters, click, run, Silas, He didn't hesitate. He spotted an auxiliary exhaust hatch, tore the cover off with his bare hands, and threw himself inside just as a wave of sharp, crystalline spikes slammed into the wall behind him. The vent shaft was narrow and slick with the oily black condensation. Silas slid down the steep incline, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically off the walls. As he slid, the voice of his mother began to play through his suit's internal diagnostic system, singing that same childhood lullaby. But the lyrics had changed. "Hush now, little sailor. Don't say a word. The iron echo is all that's heard. It takes your bones. It takes your mind. Leaves nothing but the song behind." Silas covered his ears, screaming to drown out the sound, until he hit a heavy iron grate at the end of the shaft and tumbled out onto the floor of a dark, abandoned medical bay. Chapter 16. The Anatomy of a Mimic. The medical bay was dead, illuminated only by the faint, bioluminescent glow of the black mold growing along the floorboards. Silas lay on his back, gasping for breath, his vision swimming with gray spots. He reached up to check his helmet's seal. It was intact, but the mechanical gauge on his wrist was twitching erratically, the needle spinning in circles. He forced himself to sit up, his bad legs screaming in agony. In the center of the medical bay stood an autopsy table. Resting upon it was a creature that looked like an evolutionary intermediate between organic life and the crystal entity. It was a humanoid shape, but its torso had been hollowed out, replaced by a complex array of vibrating obsidian tuning forks. Beside the table was a portable data pad, its battery low, but still functional. Silas dragged himself over to it, tapping the cracked glass screen. The files belonged to the station's chief medical officer, recorded during the final hours of Oberon Prime. Log 842. Dr. Chen. The entity does not consume biomass for sustenance. It uses it as a medium for acoustic propagation. We discovered that the mimics it creates are not independent organisms. They are localized, standing waves given physical form by the crystalline dust. They use the memories of the deceased to construct a persuasive psychological facade. If a subject believes the mimic is a loved one, their neural frequency aligns with the entity's resonance, reducing the physical resistance to assimilation by 90%. It's a predatory empathy. Silas felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. A predatory empathy. The entity wasn't just tracking him through space. It was tailoring its horrors to the specific shape of his grief. Kalen, his father, his mother, they weren't ghosts. They were hooks, designed to make his mind stop fighting the frequency. "And what about you, Silas?" a voice asked from the dark corner of the room. Silas raised his flashlight. Sitting on a stool in the corner was Kalen, or rather, a physical manifestation of her avatar, given a solid, fleshy form. She wore her standard Union Scout uniform, her eyes clear and blue, her expression filled with a terrible, heartbreaking tenderness. "Are you sure your own memories are real?" she asked softly. "Are you sure you ever left Deep Station 7? Chapter 17. Paradox Protocol. Silas stared at the manifestation of Kalen, his breath catching in his throat. His finger trembled on the trigger of the plasma cutter. "I broke the docking clamps," Silas said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I watched the station burn in the monitor." "Did you?" Kalen stood up, stepping toward him with a fluid, natural grace that had no business belonging to a monster. "Or did the entity just feed you the frequency of a successful escape? Look at your legs, Silas." Silas lowered his gaze to his left leg. The armor was torn, the flesh beneath visible through the gap. But it wasn't human flesh anymore. The fibrous lumps he thought were poorly healed scar tissue were shifting, rippling like liquid metal beneath his skin. A cluster of tiny black crystalline needles was beginning to push through his pores, vibrating in perfect harmony with the station's core. "No!" Silas roared, backing away until his spine hit the cold steel of the autopsy table. "No, I'm real, I'm here!" "The human mind is a narrative engine, Detective," Kalen said, her voice dropping into that wet, multitonal cadence. "It will invent an entire universe before it accepts its own destruction. You've been singing with us since the moment you entered the Red Lab. You just haven't realized you're part of the choir yet." Silas raised his left hand. the hand that wasn't holding the plasma cutter. He stared at his fingers. They were steady. His pulse was loud in his ears. Thump, thump. But when he closed his eyes, he couldn't remember the face of his mother. He couldn't remember the color of the sky on New Earth. Every memory he tried to grasp turned into a sound, a high-pitched chime, a wet gasp, a metallic screech. "Computer?" Silas choked out, his voice cracking. Verify current coordinates." His suit's internal speaker hissed. "Current coordinates unavailable. Internal system loop detected. Warning, neurological interface compromised. Initiating emergency containment protocol." A violent jolt of electricity surged through his suit, a built-in failsafe designed to disrupt neural hijacking. The shock threw him into convulsions, his muscles locking up as his vision exploded into a brilliant sheet of white light. Chapter 18. The Core Relay. When the light faded, Silas was no longer in the medical bay. He was suspended in midair, held aloft by dozens of thick black tendrils that had burrowed through his armor, piercing his flesh at his shoulders, his hips, and his spine. He was hanging directly in front of the massive cathedral spire of the central command deck. The illusion was gone. There was no general, no Kalen, no medical bay. There was only the vast, ruined amphitheater, filled with the frozen, singing dead, and the immense black crystal that pulsed like a dying sun. The tendrils in his spine didn't hurt. They felt warm, pumping a thick metallic fluid directly into his central nervous system. His mind was expanding, his thoughts stretching across light years of space. He could feel the 36 other red markers on the map, not as dots on a screen, but as distant ringing bells, each one waiting for the central signal to coordinate their song. "The baseline mind is stable," his father's voice echoed within his skull, joined by Kalen's voice, and Dr. Thorne's, and the voices of 500,000 souls on Oberon Prime. "The anchor holds. Prepare the transmission." "Not yet," Silas gasped, his physical lips moving even though his voice was entirely internal. Through the massive observation windows of the command deck, he could see the Peregrine. The ship was still docked in the hangar below, its automated systems running on the manual loop he had programmed before boarding. He still had the remote interface wired to his tactical vest. With a final, agonizing effort of will, Silas forced his right arm to move. The muscles tore against the crystalline growths that had bound them, but he managed to press his thumb against the center button of his vest. The Peregrine's primary drive core wasn't a standard ion engine. It was an experimental antimatter containment unit, a gift from the Union military when they assigned him to the case. "Emergency purge," Silas whispered. "Warning!" The ship's remote computer chimed through his audio feed, its voice faint but clear. "Antimatter containment failure imminent. Explosion radius, 50 kilometers. No survivors predicted." "Good," Silas smiled, his teeth black with crystalline fluid. "Close. The case." Chapter 19. The discordant harmony. The entity realized what he had done a fraction of a second too late. The tendrils around his throat tightened, attempting to crush his larynx, to stop the thought before it could translate into an execution command. The thousands of faces within the spire screamed, a deafening, chaotic cacophony that attempted to rip his consciousness to shreds. But Silas didn't listen to the song. He listened to the countdown. 5. The black crystal began to pulse frantically, its surface rippling like a stormy sea as it tried to dump its accumulated energy into the sector relay, to send the infection across the galaxy before the station was vaporized. 4. Silas could feel the signal building within his own brain, a high-frequency spike that was about to launch himself into the minds of billions of unsuspecting citizens on the core worlds. He was the gun, and the entity was pulling the trigger. 3. "Silas, please," Kalen's voice whimpered, crying out from the very center of his mind. "Don't kill us. We can live together. We can save everyone." "You're not her," Silas whispered. "She was braver than you." 2. He gathered every remaining ounce of his humanity, every memory of his real life, every scrap of anger and grief, and compressed it into a single discordant shout of defiance. He didn't sing. He screamed. One. Through the observation window, the engine core of the Peregrine erupted. A brilliant, blinding needle of pure white light pierced through the center of the station, expanding in an instantaneous, silent bubble of absolute annihilation. The titanium walls melted, the black crystal shattered into billions of microscopic shards, and the voices of the 500,000 dead were silenced all at once. Silas Vance felt his physical body dissolve into plasma, his mind finally, beautifully, slipping into the cold, quiet void of true death. Chapter 20. The Silent Void. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. It was the absolute, empty silence of deep space. The Oberon system was clear. Oberon Prime was gone, reduced to a cloud of glittering, inert dust that drifted lazily through the planetary rings. The threat to the outer rim had been neutralized. The anchor had broken the chain. 2,000 light-years away, in the deep underground bunkers of New Earth, a massive digital display screen flickered. The screen showed 37 red markers, representing the nodes of the cosmic network. One by one, 36 of those markers turned from red to a dull, dead gray. The feedback loop from Oberon Prime had cascaded through the relay system, shattering the other crystalline entities before they could complete their assimilation protocols. A high-ranking Union military director sat in the darkness of the bunker, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the monitors. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and rubbed his eyes. "Project Resonator has failed," the director said into his desk recorder. "The Vance baseline was too unstable. The psychological resilience we relied upon turned into a destructive variable. The network is dead." He reached out to turn off the recorder, his hands steady, professional, entirely unbothered by the loss of millions of lives. But as his finger hovered over the power switch, the speaker on his desk didn't die. It began to vibrate. A low, rhythmic, wet clicking sound filled the clean, air-conditioned air of the underground bunker. Click, click, click. The director froze, his eyes widening as the green indicator lights on his console began to shift, turning a deep, pulsing violet. The voice that came out of the speaker wasn't the voice of an alien entity, or Dr. Thorne, or General Vance. It was Silas's voice, low, gravelly, and perfectly clear. "We didn't need the stations to send the signal, Director," the voice whispered from the speaker, and then from the walls, and then from the very air inside the director's lungs. "The stations were just the tuning forks. The song was already inside you." The director gasped, reaching for his throat as his skin began to itch, a network of tiny, translucent violet veins appearing beneath his fingernails. And from the shadows directly behind his leather chair, a hand reached out. A hand made of smooth, black obsidian, its fingers stretching into long, delicate tuning forks that vibrated with a beautiful, terrifying, and eternal harmony.